In the summer of 1939, as Europe teetered on the brink of an all-out war, the United States Army General Staff did what passed for serious thinking in the higher echelons of the pre-war army. With an entire force that basically consisted of a few tents, some rusting tanks, and about 14 guys called Billy Joe, the Army High Command liked to focus on important matters, namely upsetting the Navy, getting cross about whatever the Navy had just done, staring sadly at yet another congressional budget in which the Navy had got more, wondering what it would be like to have an actual army, beating up protesters, former members of the army actually as it turned out, who'd fought in World War I, that sort of thing. But this time they were doing some serious thinking with a capital S. The world was, after all, going to hell in a handcart. Looking west across the Atlantic, they saw Herr Hitler riding high in Germany. He told everybody what he was going to do in his nice little book, Mein Kampf, although, admittedly, the General Staff of the United States Armed Forces hadn't read it. The book was, after all, in German. Nonetheless, people who could read books without pictures in them said that he was a very bad man. The French seemed awfully upset about him, but it was often quite hard to tell what the French were upset about at any given moment in time, what with all the moustaches, funny hats, amusing accents, and constant shouting about Les Boches. However, dimly, the Army General Staff did understand that Hitler's taking of the Rhineland, invasion of Austria, halt on loan repayments to the United States, abandonment of the terms of the Versailles Agreement, invasion of the Sudetenland, and massive military build-up might mean a fight would break out at any moment. A fight specifically with the Navy, obviously. Those sweet, sweet rearmament dollars could only go to one of two causes after all. Either they would go to the army as God intended, or to the boys in white who spent their time floating around in the world's oceans with their huge, shiny, super expensive steel rafts. On the other hand, they had a slightly unfortunate problem within their own ranks, to wit a group of officers who seemed to feel that flying was important, and potentially a war-winning thing to do. They felt this so much, in fact, that they were trying to argue for an independent branch of the armed forces, a sort of airborne navy, if you will, and there was no way on God's green earth that the Army High Command was going to stand for that kind of nonsense. They therefore did a very cunning thing. Firstly, they announced to the great fanfare that they were going to build more B-17 bombers, which ticked the box marked piss the Navy off. But then they only authorised the manufacturing of 13 planes, neatly emasculating their own officers, who at that point were really asking for about 6,500 as quickly as possible. All 13 of these planes, though, would be equipped with the most secret, most amazing bombsight ever devised by human hand, the Norden Bombsight Mark 15. Sorry, not the Mark 15, that's a naval term. The Norden Bombsight M4. Yes, totally different. Had army stamped on it and everything. Must be different. Oh, okay. This then is the story of the Norden Bombsight, the B-17, and a bunch of idealists who conspired to completely fuck up US strategic bombing for nearly the entirety of the Second World War. Well, hello. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, 4th Viscount of Ambridge, and today we're going to continue our examination of strategic bombing. I did do an episode before which covers the UK's cock-up-strewn start, so today it is the turn of our erstwhile cousins from across the Atlantic. This isn't a precise narrative format, though. We'll be looking at the development of the United States bombing doctrine, the underlying technology of the Norden bombsight, such as it was, and then what happened when theory met practice. In later episodes, we'll cover a proper narrative of the whole of the campaigns for both the RAF and the US. But this fundamental building block is very important. If you don't understand what happened before the war and the thinking that went into it, it's very hard to understand why the rest of it unfolded as it did. This will doubtless send some folks batshit crazy, and to them I say, the History Channel is right there to serve all of your needs. Please go away and leave us nerds alone. And before I launch into this, I should probably just point out a couple of things quite quickly. I will swear probably quite a bit. Please be aware of those who are around you. I will make some points which you will likely disagree with. This is okay, I'm a man on the internet, and you don't have to agree with me. But let's be polite, we can do this like grown-ups and not man-children. Lovely. Okay, buckle up, buttercup, here we go. In the era in which we live now, with a vast US military-industrial complex and a budget with near infinite number of zeros after it, one can be forgiven for failing to remember just how pacifist and apparently peace-loving the United States of the 1920s was. Like an overly sensitive schoolboy, the United States spent its time skipping around the playground of international relations saying, "Hello sky, hello ground, hello pretty flowers, no thank you, I don't want an armed forces to speak of, thank you very much," despite being really quite a big economy with potentially a lot of influence in the world. But having had a bit of a pop at this whole global power thing in Cuba, the Philippines, Mexico, and then Europe in World War I, the United States had basically decided that wars, especially European wars, were dirty, expensive, and actually quite terrifying. Europe, after all, was far away. Who gives a damn if a few Germans want to kill a few French people or a few French people want to kill a few Germans? Americans have notoriously always resented paying taxes to support perfectly reasonable causes like the military, their own protection, healthcare, or stopping large chunks of their own population winding up destitute. The United States Navy was okay in that I guess it allowed trade, but even their money was only spent grudgingly. The Navy had, after all, already got the United States in more than one war, and who knows what it might do if it had more than the bare minimum. After Woodrow, I have a dream, but my God, it's so white, Wilson had left the White House, the United States became amazingly disinterested in a messy, complex, and un-American world, content for the most part to sort of vaguely worry a little bit about China and launch the odd punitive raid into Mexico, whilst focusing on home matters like getting rich and suppressing its minorities. Unsurprisingly, then, the first doctrine on how to use airfare in the United States was a bit confused. Written in 1926 and snappily titled Fundamental Principles for the Employment of the Air Service, it basically said, and I am paraphrasing here, air power should be used to help the army by bombing the enemy right in front of them. And also it should be able to interfere with the enemy's manufacturing, provided that doesn't stop it from bombing stuff in front of the army. As so often with United States culture, it took a celebrity to trigger a national conversation. What bombing should and should not do was really first broached properly in the United States by Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. Billy was one voice amongst a few interwar thinkers, folks like Italian Giulio Due, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, founder of the RAF Viscount Trenchard, and Luftwaffe General Walter Wefer, all of whom advocated for using air power not necessarily to support the infantry so much as to bomb the enemy population into submission. Billy had really come to public attention in World War I as commander of a combined Allied air attack in 1918, and he'd used this platform to consistently basically upset everyone in the Army High Command. However, his fame had been supercharged when, in July 1921, he did some bombing trials, pleasingly from the Army's point of view, on a Navy vessel. A captured German ship, for sure, the Ostfriesland, but, it floated, it had guns, and it was thus Navy, and so the Army were basically happy. They agreed to support Billy with whatever he wanted to go and try and sink it, and after 2 days and £38,000 of high explosives, it did duly sink, at which point the press went completely crazy, claiming that this boded the end of all naval power. The Navy, being mariners, knew that if somebody blew bloody great big holes in the sides of one of their boats, it would indeed sink. Water should be on the outside. And they'd really known this since at least 1812. What they would have liked to have done at this point was to stop the trial after each bombing run and assess exactly how the boat was sinking. Maybe they could learn something which would perhaps save the lives of their sailors. Unfortunately, Billy was having way too much fun and literally couldn't stop himself from attacking. This was a shame because in just a few years' time, the Japanese would start putting quite big holes in the side of a lot of US Navy vessels, and the young men inside them had to learn those lessons in a swirling tornado of flame, shells, bombs, and death. Still, the Army was well pleased, and Billy became something of a national icon in the process, which in turn allowed him to publish several books on air power. They're pretty dry, to be honest, and I struggle to recommend them. His 1925 Notes on Multi-Motored Bombardment Group by Day and Night is a case in point. His editor really probably should have had a quick word about that title, or at least given it something snappy as a subtitle, like Bombing the Living Shit Out of Civvies Because We're America, Fuck Yeah. Anyway, in this he argued that civilians manufacture munitions, and an army without munitions could not fight, thus killing the civilians was a logical and indeed moral thing to do, or to put it more accurately into Billy speak, the hostile main army in the field is a false objective. The real objectives are the vital centers. It wasn't an original thought, though. That famous Civil War general and all-round lad, Tecumseh Sherman, had argued something similar in 1864, saying that war was so cruel that anything you could do to shorten it, you were morally obliged to do, especially if it involved really upsetting Southern slaveholders. Grant had agreed, fortunately, and so had Lincoln. In fact, if you go back a little bit further, there have been a number of commanders, I would of course call out Wellington, who would have agreed with exactly the same sentiments. And going forward, so would Arthur Harris. It is easy to write off folks like Billy and Baldwin and Dewey and Trenchard and Harris as simply psychopaths, but this was a generation who'd seen what bloody battlefield stalemate looked like up close and personal. World War I had killed perhaps as many as 20 million young men in 4 years of grinding fighting. Far more humane, surely, to end this as fast as possible, and if that meant killing women and children, well, so be it. Air power held out a chimera of a swift, if furious, victory. Bomb the home front, and it would either collapse morally or strip the front of weapons to fight on, or both. Bomb the home front, and fewer of your own citizens would have to die fighting in the trenches. However, the pacifist instincts of the United States political classes, and to a greater degree the population at large, balked at the ideas of these men. Many said that killing civilians was either unethical or un-American or ineffective or all three. There were then a group of men seeking something of a middle ground. Bomb not the civilian because they are angels, but bomb instead just the bits of your enemy's economy which will cause it to collapse. Actually, they said, bomb the important bits of the enemy's economy, and once those are gone, only then start to kick the fuck out of the civilians until they surrender, but that last bit tends to get ignored in these discussions. And so, over the hill, like knights in shining camo green, the fine men of the Air Corps Training School at Maxwell Field, Alabama, charged into the fray. Over a period of a few years, the ACTS churned out a series of thinkers who concocted what became known as industrial web theory. Bomb the choke points of the enemy's infrastructure and manufacturing, they said, and the whole system of their economy would collapse. For example, they said, drop 6 bombs on a dam in St. Louis, and the whole United States aircraft establishment would be crippled overnight. Bomb 1 aqueduct with 1 bomb and deprive all of New York City of fresh drinking water. Bomb a single spring manufacturer in Ohio with 5 bombs, and watch it cripple the entire United States auto industry. Like one of those memes on the internet with a guy explaining his bonkers theory. They saw strings everywhere connecting everything, and if you cut a few of those, just so, the enemy would be forced to surrender in no time at all. And if they weren't, only then you got on with the important business of raining fire and slaughter down upon their civilians. I've mentioned it a minute ago, but it is important to recognize that this theory was ultimately absolutely about killing civilians. For it to work, you needed those civilians to be deprived of heat, light, water, and food. They needed to stop making things, and they either needed to rebel or become an unmanageable burden on the opposing state as quickly as you could make them do so. And it was just that aiming at them was a bad thing. The rest of it was absolutely fine. Or something. Look, this doesn't make a lot of sense, but it is what it is. If you know your history, then the names of some of the men who came up with this genius plan might be a bit familiar. Collectively, they were known as the Bomber Mafia, and a lot of them were deeply involved in implementing the theory when the war broke out. Henry Hap Arnold, for example, was a leading proponent of the theory and would be in overall command of the United States Army Air Forces throughout the 1941-45 war. Carl Spaatz, who along with General Donald Wilson did a lot of the thinking about web theory pre-war, would go on to command first the 15th Air Force and then both the 15th and the 8th. Kenneth Walker was probably less well known to most people today, but at the time he was a well-known public figure, and he was key in pre-war thinking about bombing from altitude, determining that height would have little impact on the accuracy of bombing, a prediction that we will look at a little bit later. Haywood Possum Hansel would play a key role in Europe, and he spent time in Britain during the Battle of Britain, and he was a foundational thinker in the field. Ira Erker, who would later go on to talk Churchill round on daylight bombing, was another proponent of the theory. These officers, having been at ACTS at one point or another throughout the 1920s and 30s, went around the Air Corps and dispersed and spread their doctrine further. Precision bombing to win war. Precision bombing because only the Air Force could do it. Precision bombing because it would grant the Air Force independence. Precision bombing because it was a good and moral thing to do. Precision bombing because it was American. In the last video, I referred to 5 key things that you need to be able to do if you're going to conduct an air bombing campaign. You must be able to fly your plane, you need to be able to navigate said plane, you need to be able to get to your target without being shot down, and ideally get back without being shot down, you need to be able to blow that target up, and you need to know what that target is and why you're hitting it. So very bluntly, this mob didn't have a plane, they didn't really think about navigation, they had no real idea who the enemy was going to be, but they just assumed that whoever it was, they could fly higher or faster or put enough guns on the plane to avoid it being shot down, and they focused solely on the what to hit and why bit, and spoilers, they got it completely wrong. They finally got a plane in the end in the form of the Model 299, which then became the B-17. Excellent, okay, you can fly. But to make that plane effective, they needed to have a precision bombsight. So pretty much all of their thinking to that point just assumed magic would happen, and of course you could just hit the target and blow it up, and that was easy. No, not really. A brief but important aside on the blowing shit up bit of the exam question. In the US, there was a pretty good understanding, really, when you get down to brass tacks, that hitting stuff might prove to be quite difficult. In part to try and counteract that, your precision bombing might need to use a lot of bombs to hit its targets with. It's a bit counterintuitive to say the least, but you can sort of see the logic that if you drop a lot of smaller bombs into a tightly packed area, you stand a greater chance of hitting a target. So to that end, the United States adopted the M43 500-pound and the M44 1,000-pound bombs, both less than half filled with explosives, as the standard and ordnance for the United States Army Air Corps. In time, unfortunately, it became clear that both would be woefully inadequate for anything like, say, concrete or factories or bunkers or dispersed targets like railway tracks, and really what they were good for, ironically, was blowing up German housing stock or ploughing German fields. Thus, the blow stuff up with an economy of effort was on a sticky wicket before they even began, and that was before you considered the B-17's woeful bomb capacity. All right, look, let's talk about theory for a minute. I have mentioned a couple of times it was very hard to hit stuff. Why was it so hard to hit stuff? Bombing from an aeroplane is not fucking easy. Planes in the 1940s did not fly in nice straight lines. The nose and the tail would rise and fall, that's known as pitch. The wings would go up and down, known as roll. The whole plane had a habit of rotating on the flat plane, known as yaw, and all of these things could happen all at once, really with not much warning. And whilst some sailors might be standing there and going smugly, yeah, well, sure, but boats do that too, my response is very simple. Most boats don't go at 200 miles an hour, flying at 25,000 feet, and potentially rising and falling by tens or dozens of feet at a time. This is not a stable platform from which to drop your bombs. And to make things that much more complicated, your speed over the ground and your airspeed are not necessarily the same thing because wind direction pushes you around. Over Europe, winds might be described as yes, because they're not blowing in one direction consistently. And all of this means that your heading is not necessarily the same as your direction of travel. All being well, and assuming that Billy Joe hasn't lost his lunch over the controls of the boomsticks, you will hopefully be able to release your bombs at some point. You are travelling at close to 200 miles an hour when you do this, so at least initially the bomb will also be travelling at close to 200 miles an hour. But of course, as it falls, forward momentum translates into vertical momentum, forming a nice arc to the ground. Nice, of course, until it encounters turbulence and that wind, and fuck me, that arc looks wildly unpredictable now. All of this is therefore very hard to predict, and this is the easy bit. Now imagine that some fuckwit with an 88mm flak gun wishes you to have the very worst of days, whilst his mates fly around in much faster fighters than your bomber and try to kill you and your 9 compadres. At this point, you need to fly as high as you can, so high that you can barely see the target, and you were required by the big-brained geniuses of ACTS to pick out some tiny weeny dot in amongst a lot of other tiny weeny dots, some of which will inevitably, if you hit them, prove to contain the local widows and orphans shelter and be made out of cardboard and half-filled petrol cans. This, it might reasonably be said, is a high-stress operating environment. There is some good news about flying that high. It makes navigation a bit easier, and it does force the enemy to use big-ass cannons and not thousands and thousands of machine guns, which at least limits how much high-velocity lead they can throw at you, and because it takes quite a long time for that lead to travel from the ground towards you, might give you a chance to avoid it. Actually, during the course of the war, it became apparent that at about 20,000 feet, the chances of being hit by an individual flak shell were 0.02%, which sounds very comforting until you consider just how many shells were being fired. A quick concept we also need to get our heads around before we go too much further with this. We're going to talk about bombing, and precision obviously means hitting the damn target, sure, but even the lads from ACTS didn't assume that one bomb equaled one hit. So the standard method for most of the war was to simply draw a circle around a target that contained half the bombs that you dropped and measure that. This is your circular error probability, or CEP. Clearly, a lot of things will affect your CEPs, like how fast you're going, how high you're flying, whether or not some fucker is trying to kill you, that kind of stuff. If you read then that a Bombsight had a CEP of 2,000 feet, that means half of all bombs dropped landed within 2,000 feet of the target. For reference, laser-guided bombs dropped by the RAF in the 1990 Gulf War from about 10,000 feet at, 650-ish knots had a CEP of 70 feet. Keep that 70 feet in mind for now. Okay, enough prattling on about theory and so forth. Let's talk about the Norden bombsight as it was. Right back in the day, there was a chap called Henry Wimpress who worked for the Royal Navy Air Service, and in 1917 he came up with the first workable bomb sights. And post-war he managed to flog it to pretty much everybody, including the US Navy. It was absolutely terrible, but it was better than nothing. It required one to take a few measurements, flip a sort of telescope thing around across 2 fixed points to estimate your speed, and from that you could then calculate drift. In an open cockpit, wearing gloves, under fire, flying parallel to the target if you were doing it properly before you attacked it, and you'd have to tell the pilot somehow how to correct their course. On a good day, the Wimpress bombsight could, if you were very lucky indeed, get bombs to within about 600 feet of their target, flying at 110 miles an hour from an altitude of about 5,000 feet. As the years went by, people started to stabilize their sights using gyroscopes to compensate for all that jostling around, but the sights still basically sucked balls. The dream was really to make an autopilot that could control the plane while the bombardier was on final approach and then release the bombs pretty much automatically. A key name in bombsight development was a chap called Spray. In fact, it was a family of people called Spray that built an awful lot of sites and eventually came up with the first workable autopilot for the B-17 after about 20 years of work. Another key name in this story, well, I say keys, not really. We could skip over him, but I'm going to tell you anyway. He's a guy called Edgar Gurrell. He didn't really achieve anything particularly notable technically, but he did manage to create patents for a lot of things that subsequently went into bomb sights. And whilst initially he spent a good deal of time actually trying to build his own site, he realized that from the early 1920s, if he just spent his time suing people, he could make a lot more money that way around. So for the next 40 years, he literally just sued people for infringement of patents that he may or may not have held. I digress. A lot of these folks worked for the Navy because it had money and it did most of the practical flying, whereas the Army was pretty much broke and actually was very infantry focused for most of the 1920s and early 1930s. This kind of only really changed in 1927 when the Army Air Corps was charged with destroying the PD River Bridge. And well, basically after 2 days of flying and more than 20 missions, they did actually manage to hit the bridge and break it. But if you need to fly 20 missions over 2 days, there's a chance the enemy might be ready for you when you come back on the 5th, 6th, 7th or 17th time. This induced a bit of panic in the Air Corps and indeed in Army High Command, panic that was compounded by further tests in 1930 and 1931 with equally abysmal results. At best, 30% of bombs came within striking distance of a given target at very low altitudes and at low speeds. And it was about this point that someone high up in the US government had mercy on the Army and suggested that they might want to look at what the Navy had. The Navy wasn't very chuffed about this, but they very reluctantly admitted, yes, that they had got a pretty good site, and thus the Army got their first exposure to the site that the Navy had been working on for more than a decade. Not just their first exposure, the first inkling that they existed. As a foreigner, can I just take this moment to once again shake my head at the lunatics that you have running your branches of your armed services and ask why in the name of God they can't just play nicely together? Anyway, the bomb site in question was the Norden Mark 11. Carl Lucas Norden is a little bit of a hero of mine, although he probably shouldn't be. He was short-tempered, completely unself-aware, painfully unable to keep up with societal norms or even really the bounds of sanity, known as Old Man Dynamite for his temper, quite willing to hold a grudge for decades, completely self-centered, and totally unable to relate to his fellow human beings. He worked all the hours that God sent, and he is kind of my spirit animal, only Dutch, and Swiss, and really confusingly a little bit German via Indonesia. Carl was born the middle child of 5 in 1880 in what was then the Dutch colony of Java, modern-day Indonesia. Educated in Switzerland, he actually wound up in the same class as Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or as we know him, Lenin. If we're being kind, we could kind of say that Norden was a little bit of a Newtonian in that he thought that everybody and everything could be mapped out and meshed together like a set of perfectly aligned gears. And if only he understood how all those gears fitted together, he could work out how human beings worked. If we're being truthful, he had all the sympathetic tendencies of a jellyfish. For example, throughout his career as a bombsight maker extraordinaire, even when the war in Europe was raging, Norden hired as many Germans as he could get his hands on, believing them somehow to be particularly adept at engineering, but also he considered them to be completely untrustworthy at the same time. He hated them, but he worked with them. I imagine this tendency to hire German workers caused more than 1 or 2 sleepless nights in various United States authorities, who were responsible for keeping one of the war's greatest secrets, and actually it turned out that it should have done. Much later it transpired that, in 1933, one of them had sent an almost complete set of drawings to the Nazi High Command. Being a cantankerous bugger, he tried to become a United States citizen on 3 separate occasions, but the witnesses he'd asked to come along to give him his bona fides before a judge failed to turn up. On the last occasion, a judge lost his rag with Norden for wasting the court's time, at which point Norden went off in a huff and never tried again, meaning that the primary technical mind behind one of World War II's most sensitive projects for the United States was a Dutch citizen throughout. He kept almost all of his ideas and his plans to himself, keeping them in his head as far as he could, committing only to paper so much as was necessary to get something manufactured. From blueprints to calculations, only he had a complete picture of what was going on and, most importantly, why. This was great insofar as it made sure that it was quite secure because only Norden knew what was happening, but it was also terrible from the point of view of innovation since no one else could look at the reasoning and go, could we do it better? He would have fired them anyway. Norden actually began to work on the problem of bomb sites in 1920 through connections to the Navy, who asked him to look at upgrading some of their existing sites. This was a job that he claimed that he was doing, but actually what he did was fuck off to Switzerland for a year and worked on a thing called the Mark 11. In 1923, the Navy realized that if they were going to get a decent bombsight, but also if they were going to resist the urge to bury Norden's body somewhere in the desert where it would never be found, he needed a business partner, so they forced him to team up with a guy called Theodore H. Brath, who had certain things that Norden didn't. A sense of diplomacy, a vague understanding of how to mass-produce things, some kind of a business brain, and the ability not to call everyone around him a knob, that kind of stuff. Brath was also a man who managed to come up with a really cunning strategy to advertise a product which was so sensitive that he couldn't talk about it. It's thanks to Brath that despite the fact that the Germans knew all about the Norden, trainee bombardiers were required to make no notes on how the sight worked, why they had to take an oath and die rather than give away its secrets if they were captured. It's why each sight was fitted with a self-destruct device. It's why, for example, every photograph inside a B-17 until well into 1943, the Norden itself is covered in a great big canvas sack. All of this together managed to make his sights look incredibly secret, incredibly complicated, and therefore they must have been good. And in fairness, it instilled an almost maniacal level of belief amongst many bombardiers and their crews that this bit of kit was magically accurate. I remind you that the Nazis had seen the drawings, and by 1942, of course, they had dozens of examples which, if they had wanted to, they could have copied. Okay, get back to the timeline. By the end of 1925, Norden's Mark 11 was still proving to be somewhat problematic. One test bombardier said it was so complicated that it needed both hands, both feet, and the teeth to be used properly. More refinements and another year in Zurich followed, and in 1928, both the Carl L. Norden Ink Company and a new version of the Mark 11 were created. Armed with a contract now worth a cool $384,428, a bunch of rubber stamps marked secret, and an avoidance of Congress, not to mention all competition, they set about making 80 of these things. The first of these turned up in 1929, at which point Norden immediately lost any interest in the project, and Brath was left to try and manufacture these units at about 3 a month. With things going well, if slowly, the average bombsight misses were now cut from 311 feet to a mere 196 feet by the Mark 11. Bright Sparks within the Navy issued Norden with a request for a low-altitude bombsight, a 75% reduction in parts from the Mark 11, a cost of $600, and they needed the whole thing delivered in 12 months. Quite why they went to Norden for this, I do not know. His track record at this point was nothing short of abysmal. This being Norden, of course, he completely ignored the brief, fucked off to Zurich for another 12 months, and started to work on a high-altitude site which cost whatever it cost, was much more complicated than the Mark 11, and would be ready whenever it was ready. This then was the state of play in 1931, just as the Army was being made aware of the Mark 11, and just as they were about to start placing orders, Norden turned up and presented the Mark 15 prototype. It was a pretty revolutionary bit of kit. In about 10 seconds, it could, at least in theory, adjust for true airspeed, ground speed, wind direction, and angle of drift, and automatically fly a course and release its bombs when it was ready. Sadly, this being the United States, the product did not make a cup of tea too. There is one slight fly in the ointment. By 1931, the Navy really was beginning to lose any interest at all in high-altitude level flight bombing in favor of low-altitude torpedo bombing. It knew that low-altitude torpedo bombing was going to be super dangerous, so it had a backup plan in the form of also working on dive bombers, which could hit a target as big as a battleship with a bomb, probably. Since Norden had completely ignored the brief from the Navy, which might have covered some of these use cases, what he had was a bomb sight which didn't fit for the Navy's use. This presented both Norden and Brath with a bit of an issue: the potential evaporation of their only customer and the possibility that they may have to work directly for, heaven forbid, the Army. Actually, it wasn't working for the Army that they were necessarily so concerned about. What they were worried about was the exposure of the fact that the US Navy had flouted law, provided no competition for the Norden product, no specifications had been issued to others to scrutinize, Congress had just been told to sign off a multi-billion-dollar program and budgets on the grounds of national security, and of course the Army hadn't actually been allowed to see what it was that they were going to be buying for more than a decade. Nonetheless, trials of the Mark 15, now labelled the M series in Army parlance, began at the Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground. From 1923, this facility's chief scientist was one Dr. L.T.E. Thompson, who oversaw all testing of all new technologies. During these tests, he showed that the Mark 15 had a circular error probability of 75 feet and a 60 to 70% chance of a direct hit at 160 miles an hour from 6,000 feet altitude. This was astoundingly accurate for 1931. I mean, honestly, it's not that bad today. His signature led to Norden getting paid, the Mark 15 going into acceptance, and then production, and $1.5 billion heading to Norden from the Army via the Navy's procurement board. I'm sure this is entirely unrelated, but in 1942 he suddenly resigned from his post and managed to get a job in industry. In a surprising and entirely unforeseen turn of events, he found a job as chief scientist and managing director of the Lucas Harrell Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary of Norden. Funnily enough, in 1945 he left Lucas Harrell and became technical director of the Naval Ordnance Testing Station in California, where he had to test a lot of Norden kit for naval contracts, after which, once again, he was able to resign and purely through hard work and determination found a post in another industry firm, this time Norden Laboratories. What are the chances? In 1958, one Donald Jacobs wrote a book on the subject of corruption in the military contractor market. He began to question just why the Dargland data was so good compared to the operational data that we'll discuss in a bit. It turned out that Thomson, who by that point had died, had literally just removed any results that might have made the Norden site look bad. He'd falsified test data and he'd heavily edited the final evaluation report. Looking at the test results today from Dargland, I'm not actually sure if Thomson was really favouring Norden specifically. To my untrained eye, it looks like he did this to a number of different sites over a long period of time. And I'm not saying that he was on the take through the whole of his career. I'm just saying that the timing is pretty weird, and the bomb sites that were known to be as much used as a hearing aid to a blind person in wartime got ridiculously good results, whilst others, which were equally useless, didn't. Far be it for me to suggest those who paid him backhanders got better results. To make sure that not too many questions got asked about these wonderful, if weirdly hard to replicate results, Brath then got the Navy to classify the results as national security, and not even the Army got to see the full file, which I'm sure is perfectly normal for a business that's completely confident in their product and is happy for open scrutiny, right? The Mark 15 was a revolutionary product in 1931, far better than anything else that was on the market, but it was never even close to as accurate as it was supposed to be, and the assumptions then placed on it, that with this site true precision bombing would be possible, were entirely misplaced. But that didn't matter. The initial tests were what mattered, and it had passed with flying colours, and so into production this site went. Between then and the outbreak of war, the Army would drop something like 200,000 bombs using the Norden, and it never came anywhere close to getting these initial results replicated. But by then it was far too late to do anything else. The whole structure, the whole business of making war, the whole business of making bombers, the whole business of precision bombing was wrapped up with the M series. Meanwhile, fuel shortages, costs, aircraft availability and time meant that although bombardiers who went to war had received really extensive and very thorough training, they would have dropped something like 400 bombs each by the time they graduated, would have done little, if any, flying in a B-17 or a B-24, operating as they actually would within the combat zone. Speeds and altitudes were lower, flights were necessarily much, much shorter, the aircraft themselves were not fueled as heavily, nor loaded with as many bombs, and crucially, of course, there was no practice of formation flying until the last minute, and things like blind bombing and bombing on leader tactics hadn't been developed by then. This is perhaps understandable, but it was a major oversight. It meant that bombardiers who had to get a CEP of 230 feet to pass the intensive 8-week training course were, once in the combat zone, getting CEPs from 25,000 feet at 180 miles an hour, more in the order of 1,200 feet. Actually, that excludes misses of more than 3 miles from the target entirely. Before anybody goes, yeah, but you Brits couldn't hit a barn door either, I will point out that we'll cover the shit show that was British bombing accuracy in another episode. But by night, the RAF in mid-1942 was pretty consistently getting a combat CEP that would be about 900 feet. And by the end of the war, they were consistently dropping tall boys to within 75 feet of their targets, using supposedly inferior sites without automatic pilots. I will simply conclude this section by pointing out that the young men of the 8th Air Force were flying and dying on terrifying missions over Europe using a defective site, and meanwhile, Dr. Thomson was enjoying a high life as an executive back at home with no risks at all. With the war in Europe starting, America began laboriously to arm itself. Roosevelt ordered first a 10,000% and then a 50,000% increase in manufacturing capacity in the air forces. Hap Arnold created the Air War Plans Division 1, or AWPD-1, in early 1941, with key converts to precision bombing manning the staff. The AWPD-1 then went about trying to build a target list by working with a couple of business bros who claimed to know all about German industry based on German stockbroking contacts. That they had never been to Germany, that they spoke no German, nor did they have any idea how the German economy actually worked, did not stop them. Actually, they were asked to look at Japan, but they ignored this as they didn't know anybody in the Japanese stock market. Anyway, they managed to identify 154 targets in Germany to go after. 18 aircraft plants, 50 electrical plants, 47 transportation centres, 27 oil plants, 6 aluminium plants, and 6 magnesium plants. And if this sounds somewhat similar to the way that the RAF went about their war planning in 1938, then you should probably know how well this is going to go for them. 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the first US war plan was finished and submitted to Hap-Arnold for approval. Based on this plan and pre-war testing, they assumed then a 1.2% probability that, from 20,000 feet, on a target of about 100 feet by 100 feet, they would have a CEP of about 555 feet. That meant you needed about 220 bombers to destroy the target. Add into that a factor of, say, 2.5 times to account for the enemy, bad weather, and any other unknowns, and that meant you needed 36 groups to hit a given target. If those groups operated, let's say, twice a week, you could do a little bit of rough maths here and say, over about 6 months, a total of 98 groups, so that's roughly 6,400 bombers, would be able to complete the work that had been required. Put into that a few more replacements, let's call it 1,500-ish a month, something in that ballpark. They then used all of those numbers to calculate the kind of manpower, support, and shipping that they would need in order to be able to complete this plan. And then they put at the bottom of it that they would be able to destroy the entire of Germany and win the war sometime between April and September of 1944. Job's a good one. This plan was incomprehensibly awful. The force that they were proposing here was unimaginably vast. At its very peak, 8th Air Force was never able to field more than half this kind of strength, and even if you then folded the 15th Air Force in, a force which was not even envisioned by this plan, that total was barely 60 groups. Moreover, the CEP that it was all based on was off by a factor of nearly 3. This was an exercise in pure hypotheticals, which, as the war unfolded, proved rigid to the point of being obtuse and tragic. At no point did Hap-Arnold or any of his merry band of fuckwits really put serious thought into how to protect the bombers, beyond adding more guns, which of course meant fewer and fewer bombs on board. They hadn't really worked out the basic principles of air combat, meaning that commanders in the air, most famously Curtis LeMay, who was still junior to this mob, had to do it in real time. They had no understanding of European weather, nor indeed the German economy, nor indeed what the levels of accuracy actually would be in a combat zone. And of course, the bombsight that this was all based around was far more hyped than fact. Its accuracy for the mid-1930s was brilliant, but for the mid-1940s it was totally rubbish. They needed air supremacy, and they should have known that from the outset. Hansel and Erker had both been on the ground at Britain at different points by the time that the US was ramping up before it could start bombing. Hansel had moved more than a ton of documents back home before he came back. Erker had actually lived with Bomber Harris for the first part of his time in the United Kingdom. Not a single bit of RAF experience was adopted. The arrogance necessary to ignore the lessons learned at such high costs by their primary ally over nearly 3 years of fighting simply beggars belief. And it took an almighty effort, which we will look at properly in the future, to try and get the 8th to the point where it was big enough to actually operate over Europe at scale. By mid-1943, they were nearly ready. It was immediately clear, though, that they had a problem, that the whole concept of a CEP had needed to be revised. Raids instead were starting to be measured by the percentage of bombs which landed within 1,000 feet of the target, because to do otherwise would simply have been too demoralizing for all concerned. Indeed, it might have led to the abandonment of the whole effort. Nonetheless, even with this revised measure, the figures were spectacularly poor. That summer of 43, the number of bombs landing within 1,000 feet of a target was averaging only around 15%, and it did start to improve, but only through superhuman efforts of the various bomb group leaders. It got to about 35% in 1943 and jumped to about 45% during the summer of 1944. But the impact of weather and German resistance was playing merry hell with the bombsight, which was supposed to be able to put a bomb in a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. During the time of the Schweinfurt raid, for every 1,000 bombers flying into harm's way, just 16 were going to be able to put their bombs within 1,000 feet of that target, and 84 would miss entirely. Operational flying was turning out to be much, much harder than had been predicted. I mean, gee, who the fuck saw that coming? The German guns made everyone have to fly higher, and the impact of this higher flying had a much greater effect than anybody had been ready for. The difference between flying at 12,000 feet and 20,000 feet turned out to be absolutely massive, whereas it had been assumed to be relatively minor. Add to this that targets were often obscured. Of the 900 or so days that the US bombing campaign lasted for in Europe, just 190 were clear enough to do proper synchronization of the Norden site. And then, of course, there were the tactics. By the time LeMay turned up, the 8th was operating in group formations and bombing on leader. That is to say that one lead ship would use their sites while everyone else bombed when they did. That meant that you got a sort of shotgun effect over the target, which saturated it. A bit like a blanket, or a carpet, if you will. This, of course, was wildly inaccurate. The vast majority of bombers weren't even using the Norden sites, they just watched the leader. In fact, by mid-1944, whilst Hap Arnold was doing battle with the Navy for increased supplies of Norden sights, the 8th asked not to be shipped any more. They had too many spares, 3,500 of them. Another effect of this bomb-on-leader tactic was creepback. This is where bombers would release a sort of wave down the formation as each ship became aware of the one in front of them bombing, and they all slightly delayed. But it could also work the other way with overshoot because of the speed of the planes involved, and because of wind direction. Lead bombardiers were subsequently put into each group by LeMay, and that did improve accuracy massively, but they were often overriding the Norden bombsight and doing it entirely on instinct. Hundreds of hours that had been put into training were essentially rendered completely useless. The whole of the US military research establishment, the $1.5 billion spent on the M-series, it was all a colossal waste of money, time, and young lives. Accuracy did improve, especially with a plethora of gizmos like H2S, H2X, H2G, which when linked to the bomb sights in later 1944 allowed roughly 40% of bombs to get within that 1,000 feet of the target. But still, vast formations were being sent over to hit single targets just to ensure that some bombs at least made contact, and most of those planes weren't even using the sights that they'd been fitted with. At the end of the day, the story of the European campaign is brought out by the statistics, and it's pretty bloody stark. Of 7,431,000 bombs dropped at a cost of more than $30 billion, that's $30,090,045, an average of 69.2% landed more than 1,000 feet from the aiming point. There was nothing precision about this kind of bombing. The Norden bombsight had, after 25 years of development, singularly failed. And in the end, what the bomber mafia, Carl Norden and Brath had created was not a theory of warfare, it was a fucking religion, a faith devoid of proof, and an orthodoxy which crushed any alternative thoughts. It was a faith that, as we will see, would cost the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans. And from the United States' entry into the war into December of 41, through to the last 6 months of the war, it did not even have the consolation of being a costly but effective campaign. When we next return to the story of the United States Army Air Forces, we will see how the campaign degenerated from precision bombing of pinpoint German facilities to an exercise in which the bomber's target or ability to hit the target was largely irrelevant, provided it forced the Luftwaffe into the sky where they could be attacked by the United States' P-47s and P-51s. The bombers had, in effect, become tethered goats, not effective weapons in their own right. Well, on that happy note, we will leave this video for today. If you're still watching, then congratulations, you are a member of the Survivors Club, a rare and special breed who get to have their very own Survivors cookie. Unfortunately, it isn't practical for me to send it to you, so you'll need to source that for yourself, but imagine that I gave it to you. I suspect the subject matter today may prove to be a little bit controversial in some quarters, but provided we're civil to one another, well, that's okay, we can disagree, and that's what the comment section is for. Please do leave a message there. If you'd like to learn more about the bombing campaign, hit the like and subscribe button. I'll be working on the next part shortly. If you really enjoyed this and you want to help a dude out who's bought far too many books for this series, please do join my Patreon. It costs $6 a month and you get various benefits. I try and talk to like-minded individuals on the private Discord channel on a daily basis. I do video transcripts, teasers, early access where I can, and you get Jenkins's Undying Love too. If you merely want to send me a wall of text, feel free. My email is lordhardthrasher@gmail.com. Otherwise, ladies, gents, and other interested parties, thank you very much and goodbye.